Israel last time in discussing how Rome came into the Jewish picture, and that brought us into this date of 63 BC, where Hyrcanus II is made high priest and ethnarch of the Jews. Now we're going to drop down all the way to the bottom of the chart, straight under the Roman period, a little bit to the right, where you see First Triumvirate. 63, Pompey invades Palestine and captures Jerusalem. That was our discussion last week. The First Triumvirate made up of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Probably we can spend the whole teaching right now on this one subject of the First Triumvirate. That will bring us down to the spring of 44 BC. And then that will prepare us next time to look at the Second Triumvirate. And then after looking at that, probably we'll be ready to go back up to the gray timeline, which will bring us back up to Antipater, Antigonus, and Herod the Great. We'll go back into Jewish events then. So we've more or less kind of described the course of events from the founding of Rome in 753 BC all the way up for a period of 700 years to 63 BC, what's going on in Israel and what's going on in Rome. Remember that we have some difficult events taking place in the Italian peninsula around 90 BC, where all of the city-states have revolted against the capital of Rome, vying for their citizenship. They are granted this. All of the people of the Italian peninsula tribes are granted citizenship in the Roman Empire, which gives them various privileges. Some of those we've already looked at, some of those we will look at in the future. That starts really the process. It's going to be culminated this morning in looking at the First Triumvirate of the end of the Roman Republic, and it will bring about the rise of the dictatorship in Rome or imperial Rome. And again, keep in mind, all of this is important for us. Let me leave it with that. Important for us only because of the interplay it has with the New Testament. It could be important to other people for other reasons, but for us it's because of the light that your knowledge in this area would shed on your ability to interpret the New Testament. So we have a date. They more or less have it drawn there. They don't give you the date, but 60 BC. 60 BC is the date for the founding of the First Triumvirate, with the three members of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, that we will probably discuss in just a reverse order. I'm writing in on, this is my church chart, I have a home chart. They don't have a date there at the beginning of that line for the First Triumvirate. They've got it running all the way down to the spring of 44. The Second Triumvirate picking up there and running all the way down to 32 BC, which is correct, but we just don't have the dates, at least on the beginning of this, specifically drawn for us. So 60 BC is an important date in Roman history because it's the start of the period of imperial Rome. It's the start of the period of the Roman emperors or the Roman dictators. I think I said last time we generally refer to them as the Roman emperors and not the dictators, but it's the same thing. Imperial Rome or the dictatorship in Rome begins 60 BC. Now let's begin by first of all discussing these three men in the reverse order that you have on your chart: Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. We're doing them in the reverse order, but because probably in that order they're least known. Crassus is the least known of the three. Pompey better known, and Caesar, of course, well known. Okay, let's start with Crassus then. C-R-A-S-S-U-S. Crassus. Crassus enters the picture because of his finances. Crassus is an extremely rich businessman who had supported Sulla Felix, S-U-L-L-A, in some earlier strife in the Senate, which means in politics in Rome. Sulla had died about 78, about 80 BC or something, so he only was concerned in his life and his affairs with the first quarter of the first century BC. But Crassus had risen to power because of his support, financial support of Sulla, and Sulla was in power. Therefore, to support one that's in power is more or less to bring yourself into power. He, because of his financial affairs and because of the riches that he's accumulated through his business, he joins the Triumvirate in 60 B.C. with Pompey and Caesar. Now you say, well, what actually is this Triumvirate? You'll have to get accustomed to that term. You'll see it 2 times there. It's known as the First Triumvirate and the Second Triumvirate. Well, it was formed by these men. It just so happens that we have 3 men, and thus the name Triumvirate in each case, but it's formed in face of the Roman Senate. Remember the Roman Senate, which is just, well, it's comparable to our Senate, where you've got a composition of numerous men, and then you have one leader of that group, but it's all supposed to be republic or democratic in nature. And of course a dictatorship would be just opposed to that then. The Roman Senate has had a lot of power in the glorious days of the early Roman Republic, but it's soon to come to an end as it had earlier existed. And one thing that's going to bring about the final death blow and the strike of the axe against the root of the tree is the formation here of the First Triumvirate. Now, Crassus, as I've said, was a financial businessman. Pompey and Caesar were both very, very successful Roman generals, both of which, particularly the latter, Caesar, were known for their famous victories that they had won. Pompey was famous for that as well, but Pompey was an important statesman as well. So Pompey and Caesar came to power and came to prestige because they were famous, victorious generals. Crassus is just a businessman. How can you really be in control of Rome? I mean, these 3 men are binding themselves together under the Triumvirate as opposed to the Roman Senate. And of course, our guess would be, and your guess would be right, the odds are one of these men will end up supreme. The other 2 will fall by the wayside. Crassus has to think early in his period of preparation, how can I really be the one who ends up supreme? I'm rich, I have inroads in political circles, but I've never been proven, and therefore I never have the glory in the eyes of the people from military battles and military victories. So, as a result of that, in 54 B.C., this isn't even given, I don't think, in 54 B.C., Crassus leaves the Triumvirate, which just gives us 2 men then, because he chose to become governor of Syria. And it's over in Syria that he hopes to gain his military glory. The other 2 had gained their military glory in earlier victories and battles, and Crassus now wants to gain his. Now, the only place that it is given, it would be, of course, on the line of the Syrian legates there. It's just not provided specifically down there with the First Triumvirate. But if you'll look to your chart, remember when we talked about 64 being the date that Pompey invades Antioch in Syria, and the Seleucid Empire comes to an end, and Syria is made a Roman province. Then you have a list beginning with the first important general under Pompey, Scaurus. We talked about Scaurus last time, all the way down to Mark Antony. You see that line of men there. Those are the governors of Syria, or technically they're known as legates. And notice there, 54 B.C., you see the name of Crassus and a little arrow drawn in there. Well, what made him leave the glory of the company of a Caesar and a Pompey to become governor or legate of Syria? Well, it was what I'm discussing, his desire to gain military glory and military victory over here in Syria. Say, well, what type of glory or victory could he actually win over here in Syria? Well, let me put up a chart, or I'm going to draw a diagram here of Mediterranean world, since I didn't bring one along with me this morning, and I don't know that I would have one that would express everything I want to have on it. And I'll show you, because we're going to need it later on. Let's draw North Africa down here. We're going up into Asia Minor. I've got to draw it, maybe not on scale, but enough so I can here's the Peloponnese, Greece down here, and the little isthmus right here. So you've got like an Athens right here, a Corinth here, Philippi here, Carthage that's now marked off the scene here, Alexandria, Egypt here, Jerusalem here, Antioch here. You ought to be able to fill in the rest. all the way over here into Italy. And then here's Sicily, right here. Okay, that's, well, if you understand what the map is, here's the Blue Sea out here. Okay, they've been back in Rome. He goes over here to Syria. Antioch is the capital of Syria. It's the capital now that it's made Roman province. And over here, you've got, maybe this isn't quite on scale since I'm running out of room, but let's just draw the Tigris River and Euphrates River. Okay, remember I have put up a map before that would show something along this line, that Rome kind of controls this. Just a little bit. Here's Mediterranean Sea, and it just controls a little bit inland because generally of the mountain range that surrounds the Mediterranean. So it just controls a little bit inland. You could almost run it like this, and then it would come on up, something like that. Okay, notice this territory here is outside of the Roman Empire. This territory is controlled by the Parthians. This is known as the Parthian Empire. It's going to become important later on, so you need to, the Parthians. You need to be familiar with that term and who those people are. They're mentioned, the city or the nation as such is mentioned over in the book of Acts in the 2nd chapter as being represented at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 by Jews who had traveled from there. As a matter of fact, I think that's the first group of people mentioned there, Parthians, and it goes on to say other people. So that meant Jews in this area. He's probably talking about a couple of cities. One right here is Arbela and one up here is Edessa, but we'll cover that later on. The Parthians. Now Rome, we're talking about Rome as being the chief empire of the world, of this part of the world of this day, and that's certainly true, but we could almost say there are two empires in the world of this day. One that controls the Mediterranean world, Rome, one that controls the Mesopotamian world, two, and this would be the Parthian Empire here. Therefore, getting over here in Antioch, getting over in Syria, becoming governor or legate, Crassus of Syria, almost means, and of course we'll find this out in history to mean this, but he's going to go and attack the Parthians. The Parthians actually are going to be attacking Jerusalem later on as we get up into the time of Herod the Great. So don't forget the Parthians and don't forget who they are in their period of importance. Now notice they're controlling the territory that was formerly part of Medo-Persian Empire, Babylonian Empire, Assyrian Empire, way back to the date of the Sumerians, Sumerians. So the Parthians are kind of a recent development for controlling the territory, the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So they're important really for New Testament times. As you come up into the New Testament era, then the Parthians are important. So, according to our chart, in 54, he becomes governor, and he's going to take off and fight the Parthians right away. And he does the next year in 53, and he dies. Crassus is killed in battle against the Parthians in 53 B.C. He wanted to gain military glory and victory, and his involvement in military conquest or attempts is what cost him his life. So almost he doesn't deserve to be one of the leaders of Rome. Pompey and Caesar had both been very successful in their military endeavors, and Crassus, in his first attempt, proves that it is his last attempt as well. So Crassus is killed in battle with the Parthians over there in the Parthian Empire in 53 B.C. Okay, so he takes himself out of the Triumvirate in 54, and then he's taken out of this world in 53. So that just leaves us with two men, Pompey and Crassus, or Pompey and Caesar. Let's move to Pompey next then. Obviously, the events surrounding the removal and then the death of Crassus, his removal from the Triumvirate and his death, this would throw the remaining relationship between Pompey and Caesar into a tailspin. Now you've got two men. It's almost easier to control the situation if you have three. If you've got two, it's one against the other, instead of one against one, and then you still got another to kind of keep everything checked or balanced here. A little bit of the background about Pompey. We've already said some about him before. You know what he's done over in Syria, and you know what he's done down in Palestine. Pompey's one of the greatest generals and statesmen at the end of the Roman Republic period. A statesman before he was a general, but an extremely important general toward the end of his life and toward the end of the Roman Republic. Remember, he's the one who had cleared out Mithridates VI, the pirate king of Pontus. Mithridates would be, we've got the Black Sea up here, and here's Pontus. And of course, I haven't drawn all the straits here, but you've got the Hellespont right here. That's how ships could come in back and forth. Pompey was responsible for subduing Mithridates VI because of his harassment of Roman shipping over in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. So he was important for that. He also was the man who subdued Syria in 64 BC. He also was the man who subdued Palestine the following year in 63 BC. He becomes the leader in Rome after the death of Crassus, the leader in the Triumvirate, which now only contains two men, Pompey and Caesar. He becomes the leader simply because Caesar was the young newcomer in the group. Crassus and Pompey were part of the older establishment, and Caesar was a younger man, younger, that is, in comparison to Crassus and Pompey. So because Caesar was the young newcomer, then Pompey becomes the new leader in Rome. Now they start off to be very good friends, Pompey and Caesar. But because of strife over Roman control, obviously these two friends are going to part company. Obviously only one of them can be the final leader of the Roman Empire. And equally obviously, both of them would want that distinction. So moving along then to Caesar, Pompey's fairly well known. Caesar hardly needs an introduction. He's one of the most famous, well-known persons from ancient history. Maybe a whole lot of people don't know a whole lot of details about Julius Caesar, but his name is certainly known, and probably some of the stereotype images of Julius Caesar are known. And we'll get into the events of his life here in a moment. After the formation of the Triumvirate, back in 60 BC. So we're talking then about the beginning of the 5th decade of the 1st century BC. After the formation of the First Triumvirate, Caesar made himself famous by his Gallic campaigns. We're off the map, but Gaul is up here in France. That's just the ancient name for France. He made himself famous by his Gallic campaigns, and some of the printed material from Caesar has come down to us of his Gallic expeditions, written supposedly by himself. Now, as I've said before, in 53 BC, Crassus was killed. So that kind of throws the relationship between Pompey and Caesar into a tailspin. Well, around that same time, something else happens between Caesar and Pompey that's even to throw it into more of a tailspin. And that is the daughter of Caesar, Julia, had been given to Pompey in his old age in marriage. Remember, whenever you've got two political leaders like this, sometimes the way you seal the pact between one another is to marry one or the other's daughter. And so Julia, the daughter of Julius Caesar's in his 50s, he's probably about 50 years old by this time, gives his daughter in marriage to Pompey. And right around this time, around 53 to 52 BC, she died. It doesn't seem like we have some questionable events surrounding her death, but just her death kind of shatters any shallow previous relationship that had existed between Pompey and Julius Caesar. So what we have on our hands then, after looking at Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, would be a fight to the death between these two men, Pompey and Julius Caesar, for control of Rome and therefore control of the Mediterranean world. So let's get into the events that take place then between Caesar and Pompey that bring about the end to one of these individuals' lives, gives us a sole, singular emperor at the top of the Roman world, and then what happens to him as well. Well, in the first place, Pompey is passing off the scene because of his age. Caesar is coming more on the scene because of his young age and because of his recent military victories. So the Senate in order to hopefully guarantee itself continued existence, is going to have to pick one or the other, one over the other, to back. One of these men is going to come out in control. Which one does the Roman Senate want to be in control? The senators in Rome more or less realize that if one of these men comes out in control and he happens to be the strongest or the more ambitious of the two, then probably that's going to phase the Roman Senate right off out of the picture as it has existed prior to this time. So let's pick the one who's already kind of phasing out himself in life. Obviously that would be Pompey. So the Senate now picks Pompey and backs Pompey with all of its forces and gives an ultimatum to Caesar, a warning to Caesar, to stay out of Rome and to surrender his general's command. They were appointed, you see, by the Senate. That's how they became generals, Pompey and Caesar. And so obviously the Senate would have the right, not necessarily the ability, but it would have the right to take away the command of general from Caesar. And this is precisely what it does. It says, now, Caesar, stay out of Rome and surrender your command as general. Well, that's just what he decides not to do. In January of 49 BC, now we get into famous dates that are well known, that aren't just stereotyped, but that are well known. Here we have Rome. Here we have the Rubicon. It's a short river, maybe not quite that long, that empties into the Adriatic Sea. In January of 49 BC, Caesar, against the commands of the Senate, crosses the Rubicon, Rubicon, and storms the capital city with all of his soldiers behind him. The Senate more or less surrenders, and Pompey with his army flees the city. I say with his army, he hardly has anybody but a handful of men, though. Julius Caesar has just proven himself to be too strong by this period of time. So in January of 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon. That's part of the romantic image of Julius Caesar coming to power, but it happens to be true as well, and storms the capital city of Rome, causing the Senate to surrender and Pompey to flee. Pompey flees across the Adriatic Sea. This is the Adriatic Sea here. AD, this is the Aegean Sea. He crosses the Adriatic Sea and flees over into Greece, where the next year, in 48 BC, at a place up here in Thessaly, notice where I'm marking the X there, how's it spelled? S-A. I think they've got it misspelled on the chart. They've got the city instead of the territory. I'll give you Pharsalia. Pharsalia. This is the territory right here around the city that I see they do mention on the chart, Pharsalus on the chart. That's the city, but of course the battle is fought in the whole area, and technically in history it's known Pharsalia as the Battle of Pharsalia. That is on your chart, kind of interrupting in a vertical fashion the horizontal line of the First Triumvirate. Notice we go from First Triumvirate horizontally to the vertical note, 48 BC, the Battle of Pharsalus or Pharsalia, the death of Pompey, and then we go right into Julius Caesar. Well, that doesn't mean that he died there at that battle. I guess that's a little misleading. But anyway, in the Battle of Pharsalia in Thessaly, up in the area of Thessaly, Caesar defeats what is now the combined forces of Pompey and the Roman Senate. Roman Senate's still backing Pompey. Pompey has got soldiers now with him over here. They have finally traveled across the Adriatic Sea to gather with him. And it's a famous battle, but it's maybe not as well known as Actium or something like that. But it's a famous battle, the Battle of Pharsalia. Caesar is victorious here. Pompey gets in a ship and flees to Egypt, to the court of the Ptolemy, which is Ptolemy the 13th there, the Egyptian leader. We still have the Ptolemies They don't pass off the scene until 30 BC, as you see on your chart, where Egypt finally is incorporated into the Roman Empire officially. But the Ptolemy there is probably Ptolemy the 13th. I think they've got Ptolemy the 12th. The period is close there, but probably Ptolemy the 13th. He flees down here, in other words, to Alexandria, to the court of Ptolemy the 13th. So we've got him going from his defeat, we're talking about Pompey, down here to Alexandria. He doesn't have very many men following him at this time, for certain. And what empire really wants to accept a failure, a loser, into their midst? And so the Egyptians, the Ptolemies, don't. As soon as he steps off the ship and his feet touch Egyptian soil, he's assassinated, he's stabbed in the back by some of the Egyptians there. They don't really want a loser coming on their soil. So he's stabbed in the back and he's assassinated. Meanwhile, Julius Caesar, who doesn't know, there's no TV screens up in Pharsalia, Julius Caesar, who does not know what has happened to Pompey, is following Pompey in his own ship with his whole army as well, down here to Alexandria to try to find Pompey, to try to finish unfinished business. He thinks it's unfinished. It happens to be finished, though, which is going to bring Caesar into some problems as well. So he ends up down in Egypt. He has his army with him. He just won the battle. He is now in control of the Roman Empire. So that's much more appealing to Ptolemy the 13th and his sister queen, Cleopatra the 7th Philopater, and so it would appear as though things would be okay for Caesar. First of all, he captures the lighthouse of Pharos. Remember, we discussed that before, one of the ancient wonders of the world, the 7 ancient wonders of the world. In other words, as soon as Caesar gets down there, this famous, ancient, mysterious land of the Nile River kind of captivates him. And he ends up staying longer than he really meant to, or longer than he really should. Whenever he sees the land, we've talked about just this aspect of Egypt before. It's such an ancient empire. It's so mysterious. Just the events. Just think of the pyramids. There's something unique about Egypt that other countries don't have to offer. And so in arriving there, not only is Caesar captivated by just the mystique of Egyptian culture, and being in Egypt, he wants to control it as well. So he begins by taking the lighthouse of Pharos, which is just off the coast of Alexandria here. Then he met the sister queen of Ptolemy the 13th. And that brought him into a lot of trouble. That kept him probably from controlling Egypt as he had desired to. Women just seem to hold a certain sway over men, and sometimes they can divert your attention from the true important issues at hand. Cleopatra the 7th Philopater, we're finally to her. She, remember, is the one of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton fame. Everybody's heard of Cleopatra, but they failed to realize that we have a half a dozen Cleopatras on the scene throughout history. They think Cleopatra was the name of one woman in ancient history. They failed to realize it was a dynastic name, just as was Seleucid or Seleucus, just as was Ptolemy, just as was Pharaoh, just as was Abimelech, just as was Caesar. It became a dynastic name. But this, and most of the earlier Cleopatras, some of them, we have coins of them, and they're quite ugly. They did not look like Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor in her earlier days, I should say, and before her 17 divorce and remarriage episodes. Cleopatra the 7th Philopater, however, is a different Cleopatra entirely. She was an extremely gorgeous, beautiful, 19-year-old teenage girl, young woman, grown woman, whatever you want to call her. She's queen. She's a sister of Ptolemy the 13th, and she's queen in Egypt as well. This is the famous Cleopatra. She's a member, so let's say a few things about Cleopatra now that we're finally to her. And those of you boys and girls out there in the 4th grade, you remember this, and you will be one up on your teacher sometime in history. You'll say, well, Cleopatra, there were 7 Cleopatras. Which one are you talking about? And I'm sure your teacher will have no idea that she is supposed to be talking about the 7th, Cleopatra the 7th. She was a member of the Ptolemaic family, and a descendant of the half-brother of Alexander the Great. So that's what type of blood she has in her. She comes, in other words, from Philip of Macedon. She's 19 years old. If we had a Betamax here, I guess we could show Cleopatra, and then you would get the whole picture, although I'm sure it's spiced up with Burton and Taylor. Caesar is 54. Typical relationship. She's 19, Julius Caesar is 54. He's attracted, obviously, he's attracted to Cleopatra, but not so much as the next man who comes down here will be. We will discuss him probably next time. The next man makes even more fatal mistakes than does Julius Caesar. While he's being attracted to Cleopatra, it's a humorous story. I'm not going to go into all the details, but while he's being attracted, his attention is diverted by this beautiful young woman. He was blockaded in Egypt. The Egyptians in the Ptolemaic family, they want to control Caesar, because to control Caesar is to control Rome, the Roman Empire. This would almost bring then a resurrection of the ancient power of Egypt from the days of the pharaohs, because Egypt has not been a power for centuries now. He's blockaded in Egypt. That is a maritime blockade, because he's brought all his ships down here. But he receives some reinforcements, and just who they were we will discuss later on. He receives some reinforcements. He's able to break out, and he's able to, first of all, head up the coast and through Palestine and Syria and up into Asia Minor and fight some more battles. And then, of course, he's finally able to make his way all the way back to Rome. Able to break out, and he's able to, first of all, head up the coast and through Palestine and Syria and up into Asia Minor and fight some more battles. And then, of course, he's finally able to make his way all the way back to Rome. Shortly after he left, however, shortly after he left Egypt, Cleopatra bore his child, which just goes to prove what I was just saying, that he had been diverted, his attention had been diverted by Cleopatra. And she names him Caesarion, with an I-O-N ending. Now, by the way, that doesn't relate to what I'm going to say, except the similarity in the names. By the way, the name Caesarean section, for those of you that don't understand or don't know the origin for that term, comes not from Caesar's son Caesarion, but from Caesar himself. Because according to historical records, Caesar himself was born by Caesarean section. And therefore, that's why you have that term, Caesarean section, or it's generally abbreviated as the C-section. That's 2,000-year-old phrase. Julius Caesar was born by Caesarean section. And that's why we speak of a C-section today. So if you didn't know the origin for a C-section or a Caesarean section, now you do. But it does not come from the name of Caesar's son, Caesarion. They're not spelled the same. Caesarion, his son, is an I-O-N ending. A C-section, a Caesarean section, is an E-A-N ending. But it does come from Julius Caesar. So after a few more successful battles, he's going to work his way up here, ships coming along the coast, some of his men going by land. He's going to work his way all the way back over here to Rome. And what can I erase that's not important? By the time he gets up into Asia Minor and he's won some more battles and had some more success, then he sends back his famous words. What were the words that he sent back to Rome? Veni, Vidi, Vici. He sent back his words to Rome, Veni, Vidi, Vici. In English, to us, it's Veni, Vidi, Vici, but it's Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. You ever heard that phrase before? I came, I saw, I conquered. Veni, Vidi, Vici. It's Latin for I came, I saw, I conquered. We would pronounce it in English, Veni Vidi Vici. Veni Vidi Vici, Veni Vidi Vici, however you want to pronounce it. It means to us in English, I came, I saw, I conquered. That's what you're supposed to say whenever you go on a hunting trip and come back, or on a fishing trip and come back, or maybe just a game of basketball in the backyard. Veni Vidi Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Well, you remember that now. You'll really be an expert in Latin, I'm sure. Caesar now becomes the master of Rome, therefore the master of the Roman Empire. In January of 45 BC, just 4 years now after disobeying the orders of the Senate and crossing the Rubicon, in January of 45 BC, the Julian calendar is introduced, named after Julius Caesar, and of course one that we still use to this day. He's so famous in history probably because he's influenced history so much. We speak of his very birth as a C-section today. July, the month of July, was named after him. Julius Caesar, the month of July. The month of October was named after his grandnephew, Octavian. The month of August was named after the same grandnephew, Augustus Caesar. Starting in 27 BC, you've got that on your chart. He took the name Augustus Caesar. They give you both names, Octavian and Augustus. We get our month October and our month August from the grandnephew, who was going to be the founding emperor of the period known as the Pax Romana, the period of Roman peace. We will cover that man. He's even more important for our point of view, Octavian Augustus, or Augustus Caesar, than is Julius Caesar. Why? Well, that's simply because he was the Roman emperor on the throne whenever Jesus Christ was born. And he was the Roman emperor for the first almost 20 years of Christ's life. So what's going on in Rome is going on under the leadership of Augustus Caesar. And meanwhile, while this great man who establishes the period of Pax Romana, the period of peace, while he's ruling on the throne in Rome, it's almost a contrast. And we'll see this later even in Scripture. It seems like it's almost meant to be a contrast that an obscure babe is born in a stable in Bethlehem, who is to bring the real peace into the world. It just so happens that he's born during this great period known as Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But is that real peace? That's not real peace. That was just a cessation from many major wars in the Roman Empire. But Luke speaks of the one who was born, who came to bring peace to those that God favors. So anyway, moving along, in 44 BC, he's named dictator for life by the Roman Senate, which I guess would be our official date for the foundation of imperial Rome. In 44 BC, he is named dictator for life. Now, by this time, he becomes more and more disliked by his foes as well as by his friends. And if you had friends like Julius Caesar, you would really not need to have any foes. Why? A group of 60 of them began to plot against the life of Caesar to assassinate him. One of these was a man by the name of Brutus, and his name has become a well-known name in history. Brutus, a close personal friend in earlier days anyway of Julius Caesar. History informs us that on the night of March the 14th, 44 BC, Caesar dined out that evening. We even happen to know with whom he dined, a member of the Second Triumvirate, Lepidus. But he was dining out with a man on the night of March the 14th, and over dinner that evening, he discussed in humor with others at the table this current rumor of his impending assassination. When you've got 60 of your own personal friends plotting your life, probably it leaks out somewhere. And Caesar kind of thinks it's humorous that he's dictator for life now, that someone's plotting against him, particularly to think that it's my own friends who are plotting to assassinate me. So he kind of jokes about it and just pushes it aside as though it's really not anything important. History also informs us that maybe we should say the legends of history inform us, but whatever it might be, that was an extremely difficult night for him on the way home and once he got back home from dining out with Lepidus. It was a stormy, windy night. Reportedly, there were omens to be heard and seen in the sky. Various voices or animals, or maybe some of those jackals of the Old Testament, screeching and howling as he walked back home that night. He was very restless, tossed in bed. So now how do we know all this 2,000 years later? Well, it's what the legends of history tell us. He woke up from a restless night's sleep the next morning, and his wife begged him not to go and deliver his customary speech before the Senate that morning. Why? Well, because of all of the omens that had been seen the night before. It's almost as though they were omens to express an ominous future, probably a very soon-to-come future for Julius Caesar. Just after 11 o'clock that morning, all of this is certain, just after 11 o'clock on the morning of March the 15th, 44 BC, Caesar stood up before a statue of Pompey. Pompey, of course, is now dead. He stood up before a statue of Pompey to deliver his customary speech before the Roman Senate. And when he did, he was surrounded by the conspirators, and he was stabbed to death 23 times. You have that date, March the 15th, 44 BC. Since that time, that date in history has become known as the Ides of March, March the 15th, 44 BC. Really, however, on the Roman calendar, the 15th of March, May, July, and October are all known as the Ides. The Ides of March, the Ides of May, the Ides of July, and the Ides of October. It was just a particular name for that day, what we would call the 15th day of March. So we on our calendar really only have one Ides, I-D-E-S, and that is the Ides of March. But there's the Ides of May, the Ides of July, the Ides of October on the 15th of those months, and then the 13th of every other month not mentioned. The other 8 was the Ides of that month as well. So for the Romans, they had 12 Ides. Ides of all the months, 4 of those on the 15th, and the other 8 on the 13th. For us, we only have it on one. Aren't you familiar with that term, the Ides of March? Most of you are, some of you aren't. That's another one of those things, whenever I was growing up as a boy, I remember, I thought they were saying the Eyes of March. Like bringing in the sheaves, I thought it was bringing in the sheep, you know. And I heard people talk about the Ides of March, and I thought they were eyes. Somehow I made a connection between that and the eye on a dollar bill. And somehow there was an eye watching you on the 15th of March. The eyes, plural. The Eyes of March. But I finally grew up one day, I think it was last week, and I found out it was the Ides of March. No, it was longer ago than that. Crassus gone, Pompey gone, Caesar gone. Well, we can't really get into the next triumvirate yet, but let's discuss some of the events, how the events of Caesar's life affect the Jews. And that will bring us into being able to discuss more fully the next triumvirate and some of the Jewish events in next time. How did the events of Caesar's life affect the Jews? Where did the Jews come into play with all of this? Well, remember whenever I said a few moments ago that whenever Caesar was down in Egypt, his attention being diverted by Cleopatra VII, he was blockaded, a naval blockade by some other people. And I said that he, through his reinforcements, was able to break through the blockade, not really conquer or subdue the people, but just break through the blockade in order to go home. Who were some of these various loyals that came as his reinforcements? Well, one of them, for our point of view, the most important of them, was none other than this Antipater, who keeps popping up in Jewish history, this shadowy figure who for the last few decades is always lurking in the shadows of Jewish politics. He's on your chart. He's marked there from around 47 to 43 BC. up on the gray timeline. This, remember, was the Edomite, or the Idumean, who was the one behind. He was the power, the scene behind the scene. He was the power behind the high priest of Hyrcanus II. We've discussed a lot about Antipater before, and he's very important here. He's kind of an opportunist. Whenever he sees a situation where, by his own reasoning, he can figure out, if I go down there and help Caesar, I mean, the odds are, with all of these other guys pass off the scene, Caesar's going to be the important leader. So the odds are, if I help Caesar, Caesar will help me. It's a give and take. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. He's an opportunist, looking for an opportunity to help someone to get his hand or his foot in the door, knowing that kind of more or less guarantees that that person is going to return that favor to me sooner or later. It's exactly what we're going to see take place here. Remember who Antipater was, though. He's an Idumean. He's an Edomite. And he's a shadowy figure who's been lurking behind the scenes in Jewish politics all along, trying to get his foot in this Hasmonean door here. The Hasmoneans are still in control here. And Antipater is going to be important, not because of what he does as a leader or as a ruler, because he does very little, but because of what his descendants do. So whenever Caesar returned to Rome, by way of Judea and Syria, he awarded Antipater by making him procurator of Judea in 47 BC. That corresponds with your notation on the chart. Now, why they have the era, I don't know. I guess I could take a guess, and it may be a good guess, why they have an era. Notice on your chart to the left of the name Antipater. That would almost seem to imply that he ruled earlier than this. It really does it. You almost need a vertical line there to know this is when he begins as official ruler. What they may mean, though, is this role that he's played behind the scenes. He's never been official ruler in Judea or Palestine or Galilee or anywhere, really. But he has had his foot in the door in Hasmonean politics. Maybe that's why they have an era pointing to the left from the name of Antipater. But be that as it may, in 47 BC, Julius Caesar makes him procurator of Judea. See, what's the big deal about that? The big deal about that is that he's an Edomite. And Judea is a purely Jewish nation and group of people. And so we're going to have big problems on our hands when the Romans, and the Jews aren't exactly buddy up with the Romans anyway. The Romans come in and take over your country and murder 12,000 Jews under Pompey in 63 BC. So they're not exactly in your best favor. And now Rome puts, and who gives Rome the power to do this, the Jews think? Rome puts some apostate, half-bred Edomite, descended from old Esau, that wicked, profane person of Hebrews 12, on the throne as procurator in Palestine. Well, that just makes matters go from bad to worse then. Whenever he is made procurator, he celebrates by appointing his two sons to important positions in Palestine. First of all, he makes his son Phasael, Phasael. Phasael. He makes Phasael a leader under him in Judea. He's not that important, although we'll see that name. A tower was named after him. And we'll see that name pop up again. He makes his other son. Who's his other son? Herod the Great. One of the most important figures for studying the New Testament. Herod the Great. He makes Herod the Great prefect of Galilee. Ah, Galilee. Where was Jesus brought up? Galilee. He was born in Judea in Bethlehem. He was raised in Nazareth in Galilee. Herod has control particularly of Galilee. Well, at this time, that's all he has control of. But we see that, and we can see from the chart as well as from history, that this is only going to progress as time goes along, and he's going to control more. He was given control of Galilee. Galilee was a very difficult area to control at that time. We've talked a little bit about Galilee. It's on the fringes of Judaism there. Galilee of the Gentiles. You have Gentiles north of that, Jews south of that, And now Gentiles who have been forcibly incorporated into Judaism kind of on the northern border of Galilee before you reach up into the Lebanon mountains in what is Lebanon today. The same year, Sextus Caesar makes him governor of Cilicia. Sextus Caesar, he's on your chart. He was one of the governors or one of the legates in Syria, just for a year in 47. If you get that down, then I've got a few more statements and we'll be through. Jump over to your chart so we're going to notice a lot of historical notes here to make sure you're keeping up with all of these historical notes found there. First of all, go up into your gray timeline and notice the date 47. Right above the left arrow beside the name Antipater, we say Antipater. He is made procurator of Judea in that year by Julius Caesar. Then I said he celebrates by appointing two of his sons to positions. Notice under that the vertical notation, Herod, governor of Cilicia. Well, we're not really told here what we should be told, and that is that Herod is made prefect of Galilee. That's what's going to really become important to us, is that he's made leader of Galilee. And that comes about as a result of his father Antipater. How do we have then this vertical note, Herod, governor of Cilicia? That's because he was appointed to that position by, and if you drop down your chart down to the line of Syrian governors, and you see the name Sextus Caesar in 47 BC, Sextus Caesar then appoints Herod as governor of Cilicia. Coelo, as you have, Cilicia. Now, I probably need to briefly mention the reason for this last development, how Herod becomes governor of Cilicia. As I said earlier, in Galilee, Herod has a difficult territory on his hand. It's very difficult to control because of the tensions between the Jews and the Gentiles. And what we have here in 47 BC is a notorious gang of Jewish robbers, highwaymen, if you will, who are running around on the loose in northern Galilee. Herod broke this gang of robbers up. Herod's an Edomite. He breaks up a gang of Jewish highwaymen, Jewish robbers. And he has the Jewish leader of that group executed. Now that brings a serious problem into the mind of the Sanhedrin back in Jerusalem. Because Herod, at this time, Herod did not have the power of capital punishment. Neither did the Sanhedrin. It eventually goes all the way back to Rome. We could almost say that Herod would be more in his right to have the power of capital punishment than had the Sanhedrin. That would probably be true. But the point of the matter is, an Edomite who's made ruler, who's made prefect over Galilee, executes a Jewish leader, even though he's a robber. Even though the Sanhedrin would not be in favor of his robbing activities, he was a purely Jewish man that was executed by Herod the Great. So, the Sanhedrin, in the same year, in 47 BC, calls Herod before the court down in Jerusalem to give an account for himself. Well, Herod, this dashing young man at this time, comes with royal robes on and whole garrisons of his troops. Well, you know what that does to the Sanhedrin psychologically. Herod more or less stands up, and the Sanhedrin has 45 machine guns pointed at their head. And Herod says, so what's the charge against me? And so the Sanhedrin says, well, really nothing. Just wanted to talk to you. Really no charge. How could they say anything when you've got all of this whole legion that's brought down here by Herod the Great? So he's allowed to go more or less scot-free. Because he's allowed to go scot-free, that just heightens the tension now between the Jewish state in Judea and Herod, because he's a half-bred who's kind of half Edomite and kind of half Roman as far as the Jews are concerned. Really, he's half Edomite and he's half Jew. But what they think of is you're half Roman because the Romans appointed you. Julius Caesar, through your father, has you appointed. and you're half Edomite and Idumean because you're descended from Esau, and now you execute a Jewish man. Although he's a robber, you just can't execute a Jewish man. And now when you're called before the trial, the religious court in Israel, the Sanhedrin, now you bring all of your thugs along with you, and just their presence threatens us here not to pass anything in our favor which would be against you. So that just heightens the situation, the tension that we have going on here. And so at this time we have Sextus Caesar appointing him as governor of Cilicia. That's kind of how this was all brought about. Cilicia is that region just a little bit north of Galilee, north and west. And so it seems like in order to give Herod the best control of the area, he needs to control not only Galilee, but Cilicia as well. Okay, we're going to stop there. That message, if you have all of those notes complete, we'll be picking up with, we had to jump back up into Jewish politics, getting back up to 47 BC. Really, we're all the way down to 44 BC and the assassination of Julius Caesar. So we will pick up with that next time, getting into the Second Triumvirate. Sanhedrin's the religious high court in Jerusalem. The religious high court. There are more Sanhedrins. There are probably dozens, maybe scores, maybe hundreds of Sanhedrins. But the one that's in Jerusalem, since that's the capital of Jewish thinking, the one in Jerusalem is the one that controls the most power and has the most prestige. Most people think of the Sanhedrin as the and not a. They think of it as definite article, not indefinite article. That's only because of the importance of a Sanhedrin that is located at Jerusalem. But you probably have Sanhedrins in Jewish communities up in Asia Minor, up in Greece, maybe over in the Parthian Empire, and so forth. They can try political cases, but they don't have the power of capital punishment. That has to go back to the Romans. And Herod, because the Roman Empire is so new at this time right now in Palestine, to my knowledge, the procurators or the prefects don't have the power of capital punishment. They certainly don't have it in the eyes of the Sanhedrin. We know that by the time of the New Testament and the execution of Jesus Christ, that the Roman prefects or procurators certainly do have the power of capital punishment. We know the Sanhedrin doesn't. The Sanhedrin tries Jesus and finds him guilty, but what can they do about it? Nothing, except appeal to the Romans and try to trump up a political charge and not a religious charge. We'll discuss all of this later. And bring him before Pontius Pilate, who was the procurator, or probably the earlier term was a prefect up in Caesarea, which was where Herod's palace was, which was built by Herod the Great. And Pontius Pilate was the prefect from 26 AD to 36 AD. So we know that he was the prefect, not only from the New Testament, but from the historical records, as well as a recent inscription that was found at Caesarea in 1961. I have pictures of that I will bring whenever we get to that. It lets us know that Pontius Pilate was the prefect then. My point in saying that is to say this, that the Roman prefects had the power of capital punishment. And they particularly were the ones to try political cases and not religious cases.